So now I'm going to shift the focus onto the results themselves. It's slightly less entertaining in a way, but nevertheless, this is really the meat of the project that we've completed. And so to start, a little dry, but nevertheless, it's very important. The study design, we recruited 20 healthy volunteers. It was important that we had good quality data when it came to the brain imaging analyses, and so we were quite strict in identifying good, clean data sets. It's a problem with many drug studies, and psychedelic drug studies are no exception, that volunteers can move a lot in the scanner, and we had that. That was the case certainly in 4 or 5 of the participants, and that's really why they were excluded from the analyses. The average age was 31. We had 4 females in the sample. Typo, they all had some experience with a psychedelic drug. That was a safety consideration, so we could feel more confident that they would tolerate this particularly challenging environment. All our volunteers were screened very carefully by a psychiatrist. They had a mental health assessment, and we also carefully assessed their physical health. The volunteers are then, once they're deemed eligible for the study, they are scanned on 2 occasions. On one of those occasions, they'll receive LSD, and on the other, they'll receive placebo. The drug's administered intravenously. We balance the order of the administration, so half of the sample will have LSD on their first visit, and half will have it on their second visit. And there are 2 weeks that separate these 2 scans, these 2 visits. We use 3 complementary brain imaging modalities in this study. That's really one of its strengths, that we could utilize different scanning techniques and kind of compensate in a way for some of the limitations of certain techniques. So we use 2 functional magnetic resonance imaging techniques, arterial spin labeling, which gives us a measure of blood flow in the brain. We use the classic bowl signal of fMRI, which allows us to look at communication patterns in the brain network properties. You've heard a little bit about those, and I'm going to present them in more detail shortly. And we also use magnetoencephalography, which allows us to pick up the higher frequency oscillations in the brain, something that fMRI can't detect. So you can see that these different techniques, when put together, give us really quite a comprehensive perspective on what's going on in people's brains under the influence of LSD. And really, this isn't something that well, certainly no one's ever done this before with a psychedelic drug, and I'm not sure if there are any other psychoactive drug studies where MEG and fMRI have been utilized in the same session. The fMRI scans began around about the peak effects of LSD, or the beginning of the peak effects, 80 minutes post-injection. The onset's a little bit quicker when the drug's given intravenously compared to when it's given orally. Also, the experience is slightly abridged. That was one of the reasons why we chose to give the drug intravenously, in that it would be more manageable for us. And if our focus is on the scanning, it allows us to do that quite nicely. The MEG scanning was done a little later, and the effects were slightly attenuated at this time point. But nevertheless, as you'll see from our results in a moment, the effects were still pretty marked with the MEG. So our main findings, I think it's important to focus just on a small number of the findings that are important. And so what I'll do is I'll present ones that speak to the potential of LSD to profoundly alter consciousness. And the other one that I'll focus on is the perhaps a slightly more tangible problem, but nevertheless kind of a classic aspect of the psychedelic experience, and that's the potential to produce visual hallucinations or closed eye imagery. So focusing on the first one, so when we want to try and better understand consciousness, we have to think very carefully about that problem. One of the criticisms of consciousness research often is that researchers don't do enough to define the nature of the problem, what is consciousness. So this is something that we thought very carefully about. And one classic aspect of the psychedelic experience is something that people who take psychedelics, and it's also something that's referred to in the academic literature, they refer to it as ego dissolution. So it's really quite a hard thing to fathom, really, if you haven't experienced it. If anything can be compared to it, it might be akin to what you hear described in the context of spontaneous mystical or spiritual type experiences. And that's this breakdown of that sense of self, that sense of identity or personality that pervades our consciousness ordinarily and feels so sort of familiar and perennial, always there, and something that feels very solid. But it's interesting, and this is really kind of key and why I believe, psychedelics are special, is that they alter consciousness in such a way that one's level of wakefulness is really maintained, yet the quality of consciousness is profoundly changed. And so one could be just as awake as ordinarily you are, but that sense of self seems to be absent, and that's really quite a curious state, and so something that's interesting to study, of course. We asked all our volunteers after they came out to the scanner, we did ratings in the scanner, subjective ratings. We also did them at the end. We also did these structured interviews with them, and the first question we asked, I think, was it was quite a broad question, what was it like in the MRI scanner? This is one of our volunteers, and he said that it was intense. I had a sense of being inside of myself and outside of myself at the same time. I definitely felt removed in some way from what I would usually describe as myself. So this construct of the ego could be referred to as a sort of umbrella construct or a constellation construct. So it includes many different things, like one's sense of drive, one's personal narrative or story, sense of identity, things like reality testing, self-reflection, time perception, ownership, all these different things. So they kind of come together and make up what we refer to as the ego or the self. And these personal pronouns that are so prevalent in our everyday speech when we use words like I, me, or mine are kind of evidence in a way of that pervasiveness of the ego in our normal consciousness. Recently I heard someone describe normal waking consciousness, or in other words, ego consciousness, as consciousness that has a focus, that has a direction or a purpose. And actually the term he used was that it's consciousness with a point, like an arrow. It's going somewhere, and I thought that was quite nice. And so that can, lead us to think, what would consciousness be like if we didn't have that sort of direction and point, and what would sort of be a corollary or what would go with that, what would go with that state. Something that we did recently, I just want to refer to this briefly rather than go into the details of the analyses, is to try to develop a measure of ego dissolution. We ask our volunteers after the scans, and also actually during the scans, to rate what we call a visual analog scale of the extent of their ego dissolution, but in a way that feels perhaps not enough. We think we could do a little bit more with this. So we developed a scale that has about 8 items. We included items that refer to what we understand as ego dissolution as it's described in the literature and as people describe it. We also looked at something else. We looked at something we refer to as ego inflation. So these items included things like, I felt like my viewpoint was worth more than other people's, or my ego felt inflated. And then those ego dissolution items had things like, I experienced a dissolution of myself or ego. Another one, I felt less absorbed by my own issues and concerns. What we did, which was quite nice, we ran this questionnaire study, and we looked at different drug states, so not just psychedelics, we also included cocaine and alcohol as well. And we asked people to rate this scale according to a typical experience with those drugs. When we did that, we found this strong positive correlation between ego dissolution scores and the dose of the psychedelic that the individual had taken. Why I was showing this chart really is to provide these comparators. When you look at cocaine, you see a different profile, a kind of opposite profile. There's actually a positive relationship with these ego inflation items. So the higher the dose of cocaine, the greater were scores on this ego inflation subscale. When we looked at alcohol, we didn't see a relationship there. So that's something that's interesting to think about, that maybe, if we have this view that there's something special about psychedelic drugs, I just wonder, an idea I'd like to submit is that perhaps it is this ego dissolution that lies at the heart of why these compounds are special. Maybe it's something exclusive to this class of compounds. But the name of the game and the reason why we did this work was to look at mappings between changes in brain function and brain activity and those subjective items. The reason why I went into so much detail about the subjective side of things is because it has equal value, really. The challenge is to make this mapping, and so we can't make light of the psychology. It's equally important. So now that you've heard a bit of context about this rating of ego dissolution, I can tell you some of the effects that we saw with LSD that correlated with it. And what we're seeing here is an analysis we call functional connectivity. We're looking at how certain regions in the brain talk to other regions in the brain, in this case the whole of the brain. And what you're seeing in the top row there is a subtraction between the LSD condition and the placebo condition. You can see a structure in purple. That's the region that we were looking at in terms of it talking to the rest of the brain. It's called the parahippocampus. It's important in things like memory, navigation, but also higher level things like imagination, forming the big picture, or gestalts, the sort of whole picture. Also mental imagery. So this subtraction here, you can see that there are some patches in blue. These are regions that normally have quite a strong functional connectivity with the parahippocampal regions, meaning they talk quite a lot to each other. Now, what we see under LSD is there's significantly less of that communication. So there's a kind of disconnect between these regions. There's a kind of disconnect in this circuit. And we learn from running our correlation analyses that there's something important about that, because it correlates very strongly with these ratings of ego dissolution. So the greater was the disconnect between these regions, the greater the disconnect in this circuit, the greater was the ego dissolution. Now, this makes sense in the context of other work we've done, and also in the context of neuroscience's understanding of the nature of the self in the brain. Circuits that we're looking at here belong to a certain network referred to as the default mode network, which is arguably probably the best candidate for the sort of neurobiological substrates of the sense of self that neuroscience has. So this result made sense. Here it is again, just shown a little nicer. Credit to Leo Roseman for making this image recently. Another thing we did, of course, was to use magnetoencephalography to look at the faster activity in the brain, the oscillating activity in the brain. So if you think of brain waves, you might have seen images of these, and often they're detected with another technique called EEG. You might have seen people with caps on their heads where brain activity is being measured, or they have electrodes stuck on their heads. So that's EEG. We use MEG in this case. It's a slightly more sophisticated technique in that it can see slightly deeper in the brain, and the signal that it picks up is a little bit clearer. What we did with this measure was to look at the different rhythms in the brain. And when we did this, we found that the set of rhythms, pretty much all of them in the sort of range that we looked at, showed what we call a decrease in oscillatory power. So what does that mean? It means that the amplitude of those rhythms, the height of the oscillations, became less. The oscillations became shallower. And that tells us that those rhythms are, the units that are contributing to those rhythms are functioning in a less synchronous way. So there's a kind of desynchrony going on in the brain. Now, one particular rhythm, which ordinarily is very prominent in the brain, is this alpha rhythm, and you can see a peak in the alpha power in this range here, which coincides with the range of the alpha rhythm. You can see in blue this is placebo, and there's this very, very prominent peak where a lot of the rhythmicity of the brain is kind of being dominated by this particular signal, this particular rhythm rather. And why is this interesting? Well, if we put it in a little bit of context, alpha is known to be maximal in humans relative to other animals, and it's also maximal when we reach adulthood. So that's when this rhythm is most prominent. And for those reasons, you might infer that there's something important about it. Maybe there's something important about it in relation to consciousness. And then we see under LSD that we get really quite a dramatic collapse in this alpha band. It's still there, but it's very, very much reduced. Now, when we look at where in the brain alpha was most reduced, we actually see that it's reduced in a number of different regions. But if we ask a slightly more nuanced question, which is where in the brain were alpha decreases that correlated with our subjects' ratings of ego dissolution? And when we ask that question, lo and behold, this same region where we saw a disconnect earlier, it's the posterior cingulate cortex, shows up. It's this region where you get a bigger the drop in alpha power, the greater were people's ratings of ego dissolution. So what we're getting from these kind of measures is a sort of impression of qualities of brain activity that may underlie the sense of self or the sense of ego. So we're not just doing this work to learn how LSD works in the brain. Granted, that's a very interesting question, but we're actually learning something important about the way the brain works more generally. Another analysis that we did in collaboration with a researcher who's back in Argentina now, Enzo Tagliazucchi, very, very clever chap who's done a lot of nice analyses for us. This work's published in Current Biology. A lot of the focus so far in terms of sort of media interest in this research has been on our paper that's been published in PNAS. This paper is actually being released this evening in Current Biology, so you might be interested to look that up and have a read. It will be open access. So what we're looking at here is global functional connectivity. So we're seeing in red regions that are talking essentially more to the whole of the brain. So one thing that we can say about this effect is that the brain's operating in a more globally integrated fashion. In a way, it's functioning in a more unified way. And these regions in red are actually regions that belong to quite high-level brain networks, and brain networks that are implicated in the modulation of consciousness. There's another image here recently made by Enzo, which shows connections in the brain that are stronger, if you want. These are functional connections, so this is the strength of the communication, and these are connections that in red become stronger under LSD. You can see that there's quite a bit more red than blue. Blue were actually connections that were stronger under placebo. What's interesting is that quite a lot of these long-range connections are those that are stronger under LSD. And more generally, there was an increase in connectivity in the whole of the brain under LSD. Now, just to put this in a little bit of historical context, or recent history at least, this is an analysis we did with psilocybin, which produced these particularly attractive results, where you can see under placebo, most of the communication in the brain is confined to particular communities or cliques, and under psilocybin you get a much more open communication profile, where regions and communities in the brain that ordinarily don't talk to each other so much are beginning to talk to each other much more. So we think this is sort of reflective of an increase in the flexibility of the brain and the way it's functioning, which maps onto perhaps an increase in the flexibility of mental functioning, cognition, or thinking more generally. So here's our a correlation which looks at the relationship between that global integration that we see in the brain, and people's ratings of ego dissolution. We did this a number of different ways, and we saw strong positive correlations between the magnitude of this global integration in the brain and people's ratings of ego dissolution. So how do we understand this? Well, here's a description from a volunteer in a separate study about his or her psychedelic experience. He or she says that there was a feeling of no boundaries. I did not know where I ended and my surroundings began. Somehow I was able to comprehend what oneness is. So this experience of a loss of ego boundaries, the loss of that sense that we normally have of being an entity, an individual that's somehow separate from other people and separate from the rest of the world, that's something that seems to break down under psychedelics. And you hear this phrase that people often use, that I feel at one with things, I feel a reconnection. Often it's framed in this mystical or spiritual way. Now, what's again, interesting about the work that we've done is, although this is a psychological experience that, granted, it's very abstract, it's a very difficult problem that is hard to break down and define and study. But what we're doing here is we're really getting, I would say, the beginnings of some idea of the changes in brain activity and brain function that map on to such an experience, this unifying effect in the brain correlating with what could be described as the unitive experience. So just to finish, I'm going to talk about the perceptual effects of LSD and what changes in brain activity correlated with these. Now, as David said earlier on, when I originally really wanted to do this research, I was interested in the idea that the psychedelic state is similar to an extent to the dream state, that it's a kind of hybrid between waking, because people are awake, and also dream sleep or rapid eye movement sleep. That's something that we could probably do some more work on in the future to try and address that question in a more direct way. There's a bit of indirect, suggestive evidence that there is a relationship between what you see in the psychedelic state and what you see in the dream state in terms of changes in brain activity. But certainly, subjectively, and in terms of the psychology of these states, many people have made comparisons between them. Here we have a quote from a nice book on psychedelics and psychedelic research, which says that in its imagery, emotional tone, and vagaries of thought, the psychedelic drug trip, especially with eyes closed, resembles no other state so much as a dream. So what did we see in the brain when we looked at the visual system, the visual cortex, and particularly the primary visual cortex, which is a part of the brain at the very back, which is responsible for processing very low-level features of the environment. So what we did here is to look at communication patterns between the primary visual cortex and the rest of the brain. You can see on the left the placebo condition. Most of the communication between the primary visual cortex and the rest of the brain was confined or restricted to the visual system. So that specialized system was kind of keeping itself to itself and doing that specialized function that it does. This is what your brains will be like at the moment, I imagine. Or if you're on LSD, I hope you're not. This wouldn't be the right setting to do LSD. We found that there was this much more expansive connectivity profile where the primary visual cortex was talking to regions of the brain that ordinarily it doesn't really talk to, at least with the magnitude that it does under LSD. So this interesting expansion of visual processing under LSD, perhaps an expansion of the visual experience. So the key question then, and the name of the game, what we're trying to do, is to make mappings between these changes in the psychology. So we looked at people's ratings of complex visual imagery. It's a bit flippant, really, isn't it? I should probably provide a more, sophisticated image than The Simpsons. But what we found was that the more people rated complex visual imagery, and by that we mean things that are more complex, then things like flashes of colour, geometric patterns, the slightly typical but perhaps slightly stereotyped ideas of what psychedelic is, in terms of patterns, and if you think of psychedelic art and such like. So these are visions, really. Our volunteers had their eyes closed, so they're not looking at the outside world and seeing, entities walking across the room or anything. They have their eyes closed and they're seeing these things essentially in their mind's eye, but they see them very vividly. So they may see people, they may see animals, they may see landscapes, they may see these complex scenes, and they often describe them as having a dreamlike quality. So the greater was this effect, the greater was that expansion in visual cortex, functional connectivity, which I just showed you. So what about the future? I can summarize this relatively briefly. Some questions that are interesting to address for us, and also a sort of general agenda, perhaps. I mean, what I've described and what we've found so far by looking at the effects of psychedelics on the brain could be, well, we've described it as the effect being sort of similar to a sort of increase in disorder or disorganization in the brain. Perhaps you could describe it as a kind of scrambling effect. A more sophisticated but also a more accurate term is to say that there's an increase in entropy or the level of unpredictability of the brain activity under a psychedelic. Certainly that's true of cortical activity, so that's the outside of the brain that humans have so much of. And that's true when we look at the average activity over a period of time that we do our scan. But what we might think about doing in the future is to look at things with a slightly finer resolution. We might look within scans at certain experiences, transient experiences. Ideally, these should arise spontaneously rather than be evoked, because then they're not so interesting, really. And also, if you ask people to do things under a psychedelic, often it's quite hard to get them to do the thing that you want them to do. And the really interesting stuff are things that do arise spontaneously. So when they're not evoked, when they arise of their own accord. So this quote here is kind of speaking to that principle that there's more to this than just an entropic or a sort of chaotic effect in the brain. And it's Carl Jung saying that in all chaos there is cosmos, in all disorder a secret order. And if this principle is true, that psychedelics can facilitate insight, perhaps about oneself or one's relationships or one's relationship with the world at large, then it makes sense to think that it's not just all chaos in the brain, that there are some aspects of order that are there that could be very interesting and important. So fine-tune our questions, things like what is the ego? I talked a little bit earlier about the way that we might do that. That's just one example. There are others. Can psychedelics produce insight? And is the psychedelic state like the dream state? So these are questions that are interesting to us. Also, consciousness research, why are psychedelics special? I talked about that a little bit. Perhaps making it clearer that it may be that this ego dissolution aspect is an aspect of why they're special. Also, when you think of the term psychedelic, that it's mind revealing. If we can get that's what it means. If we can get a better handle on these moments of revelation or insight, then I think we'll be doing some really important work with these compounds. Of course, applications in psychiatric research. We can look at the way psychedelics model certain mental illnesses like psychosis, perhaps certain states that are associated with certain mental illnesses, perhaps aspects of early psychosis, so the onset of a psychosis when things start to feel strange, when one's sense of self starts to feel fragmented. So rather than just offering this sort of crude comparison between the psychedelic state and, say, chronic schizophrenia, which I don't think is accurate, we might think a little bit more carefully about what aspects of psychosis psychedelics might be able to model, and that might help us to better understand those states, both their psychology and also their underlying biology. Also, novel therapeutics. We've recently completed depression trial. You heard a little bit about that. That work's actually been accepted recently by Lancet Psychiatry, the first phase of it. So in about a month's time, we're going to be telling you about that. So that's going to be fun. And also work looking at healthy people taking psychedelics and interesting things like changes in well-being, changes in personality, perhaps effects on creative thinking that could be interesting. Looking at longer-term effects of psychedelics, so not just the drug trip itself, but if people change after a psychedelic, as has been reported in the literature and as we've also reported, if they change in the longer term and you see interesting changes like changes in personality, so openness, open-mindedness, well-being, optimism. It's an interesting, very interesting question, I think, are there some neurobiological underpinnings of these changes? Is it just something psychological? Personally, I doubt it. And so what's going on at a biological level? So I'd just like to thank you for your attention. I've got some big thanks here, of course, to David and Amanda, who've made this possible for me, the Beckley Foundation, the Beckley staff and its supporters. Also the crowdfunding campaign that really allowed us to finish this study and do the analyses. I think I spotted a couple of supporters in the room, so a huge thank you to you for allowing us to get this work done. And also the team, and often they don't get the thanks that they deserve. I mean, most of our staff weren't employed to help us, and there was a huge number of these staff, and they would travel across the country often to provide medical cover for our scans, the likes of Ben Sesser at the front, and Tim Williams. I'm not sure if he's here, but we had a lot of just very generous people donating their time to us, and we're very grateful to them for this big team effort, really, that we did to get this work done. So thank you very much again.